Good morning, everybody. Welcome to SafeDefend Live. I am Dave Evans with my favorite doc, Doc Greg Vecchi. Now, Doc, I got to ask you a question, and it's a silly question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. My
All right.
wife loves Criminal Intent, and the main character looks a lot like you. Was there any, collaboration when you were working in the FBI and the special division you were in, or
Oh,
not? Because my wife
I'm,
wants to know.
I'm glad you brought it up. Absolutely nothing.
Y'all look. I mean, the main character and you look exactly the same, right? It's crazy. It's like your doppelganger.
Well, I tell you what, I wish I had access to that nice jet airplane.
Oh, no kidding. Well, the 89th Airlift Wing does have those available for use by our federal agencies. I can connect you with somebody someday if you need that.
That would be awesome, and I'd like to actually employ you to be the pilot because I like
No,
the way you talk.
I hung my flight suit up a long time ago. So I'm excited today because we're going to talk about some misconceptions on mental health issues and how they drive or do not drive targeted violence in schools. I think this is an important issue. I think we don't spend enough time thinking about the person. We spend more time thinking about the act, and we really need to help the people. So let's get into this.
Sure. Well, it's one of those things where there's a ton of misconceptions out there because every time there's an active shooting or active killing or some sort of targeted violence attack, mental illness and guns are always on top of the list as basically the targets to go after in terms of the culprit and things like this. You know, that it's because of the gun, it's because of mental illness. And I've briefly touched on this a little bit. I'm not going to talk about guns today, but I am going to talk about mental illness because there always seems to be an alleged connection, or it seems like it's connected, or that it's a reason that they go violent, or that it's the cause of the violence, and it's simply not. And if you look at mental illness as a cause of targeted violence, a cause of an active shooter, active killer, active whatever, right? Um, you're gonna get a false negative or a false positive. Most likely, it's going to be a false positive, meaning that you're assuming that because this kid or this employee or whoever the concerning person is, that they have some sort of mental disorder, mental illness, personality disorder, whatever, that automatically means that they are going to be violent. And that's simply not the case. But it doesn't mean that you dismiss it out of hand either. You certainly got to consider it, because I consider them more enhancers than actual a cause. And we've been over a lot, that pathway to violence and those stages they go through, the grievance stage that leads to a crisis, that leads to violent ideation, where violence becomes the answer, and then it goes on research and planning and preparation, and we all know that, right? And then the attack. And those are your direct behaviors. Those are the things that you really have to look at in order to determine if they're even on the path to violence, and if they are, where are they on that path? Because that dictates what you do in terms of interventions. Okay, talked about that before. But there is this thing of mental illness that does factor in to the pathway to violence, not as a direct cause, but I just call it a threat enhancer. And it's something that you got to take in consideration, and you got to really look at it from the standpoint of understanding how does the mental illness or personality disorder affect the perception of that person's grievance, because that's really what it is. It's just that it's changing their viewpoint of the grievance, making it worse than it really is. And when you look at some of the ones that have a tendency to affect perception, the one that's on top of the list is going to be some sort of psychosis, right? That could be schizophrenia. It could be paranoid schizophrenia, which is very problematic because they're paranoid, right? They think people are after them, and it adds to that perception that the grievance is something that it really in reality isn't, but to them it is. And that's what you have to understand. And so, when we're looking, for these concerning behaviors, we're not doing it from a clinical standpoint. We're not trying to diagnose them. We're looking at the behaviors. And if you understand the behaviors and you get an idea, okay, well, they might be experiencing hallucination or a delusion. And then we can then still use the crisis intervention approach and all the stuff that we do when we're trying to help people with mental illness alleviate that perceived grievance, which is being, amplified by a delusion or hallucination, right? And so these psychotic disorders, some of the characteristics are delusions and hallucinations. Now, people, sometimes mix those up. Um, a delusion is something that's a belief. It's a firm belief in something that doesn't make sense because they're typically not in our reality, right? Their perception of someone who they believe in their school who's after them because they're an alien, right? Or they work for the government, a CIA assassin or something like this. And as goofy and as outrageous as that sounds, for that person who's experiencing it, it's very, very real. And they absolutely believe that that person works for the CIA, for example, as crazy as that sounds to some people, right? And that is a delusion. It's a firm belief, right? If they say that they can, jump off a building and fly, they really do. They really do believe that, even though it doesn't make sense. A lot of times, there's religious undertones on this, that they're the devil or some sort of an evil spirit. Okay, is making them do what they're doing. And then you get into the hallucinations, right? And the hallucinations are sensory perceptions that to them are real, but really aren't happening. And the most common one are the voices that are telling them or suggesting to them that they kill that person who is causing the grievance, which is basically amplified by the delusion that the person's from the CIA. So that's where it becomes problematic. So it's not so much the disorder or the mental illness that's causing it. It's just in the perception, and we have to look at it from that perspective. That we're not in the process here trying to diagnose or prognose. We're looking at the behavior, and when they appear to be delusional, believing things that really aren't true, or having hallucinations, we got to approach them and intervene with them on that level. And so, some of the things to keep in mind is that they don't have this. They're not in the same reality as we are. That's number one. So they kind of lose contact with reality. Sometimes they develop this whole inner world. It's like fantasy, but to them, they're living it out and it's real. And sometimes their thinking process kind of unravels and it becomes, problematic. And so then you get, kind of things like unusual behaviors, bizarre behaviors, difficulty with social interactions, things like this. Poor hygiene is associated with psychosis. And so when you're dealing with the people, the biggest mistake you can do is confront them or push back that, oh, those voices aren't real, or no, you don't try to jump off the building, come on down, you can't fly, if you jump, you're gonna kill yourself. Because what happens is, in this paranoid, especially if they're paranoid, you become one of them, the very thing that they're paranoid about. Now you get lumped into that bucket with the other people who are after them, who are causing the grievance. So when you're dealing with someone who might be psychotic, might be, if you're doing a crisis intervention, some sort of an intervention, you want to just hear them out, because these people are not typically violent. They can be violent, certainly. And in this circumstance where they believe someone's after them, or they hear voices that are telling them to kill them, and it's very real to them, that's going to obviously affect a grievance, right? But the thing is that they're typically they're suffering a disorder. They're not trying to do this, not trying to be violent. They're very different from like a psychopath, for example, or some other personality disorders. So they might feel threatened. They might feel out of control. They might feel that there's no one to help them. And just stepping forward, and again, just like we've said a million times, you see someone in crisis, you see someone with concerning behavior, you want to approach them and try to be their helper, be that social support. The difference is that when you're dealing with someone who has a mental illness, you really have to understand some of the characteristics that we're talking about today on the psychosis. If you Because if you approach them from a perspective that it doesn't make them feel safe, it doesn't make them come out of the crisis, but only adds to them with the fear that you're going to become one of them. That's what you don't want to do, and that's some of the stuff to keep in mind. It's well beyond just talking about it here on SafeDefend Live, but We've got those at SafeDefend. We've got some intervention strategies for suicide. We got some intervention strategies for dealing with these various disorders. And I'm sure you run into this when you were in the military.
Yep. Yep. You know, mental illness is a scary thing because we all go through some form of it in our life. And I don't want to act like, everybody's Superman. We all have issues with depression or other things, events that happen in our life that put us in a certain psychosis. And we really, as human beings, need to be thoughtful. We need to understand that people that are dealing with real mental health issues, like a psychosis, such as schizophrenia or being bipolar, you cannot deal with them in the same way you deal with other people, and you have to be very, very careful in choosing your words. My wife had a good friend whose parents had him anytime he wanted to check into a mental health institution, he could. He walked in the mental health institution to check in. They said they were full. The next day, they found him. He had committed suicide in the woods on their farm. And we have to take this stuff seriously. When somebody says, I need help, or shows signs of needing help, you need to get them the help they need. I had 3 airmen in my command that showed signs of mental illness, and we got them help immediately. They didn't necessarily like it initially, but you know what? It kept them in the military. It got them through the challenge they were dealing with, and they're doing great things now in the world. So don't ever take that as a joke, or it's not serious, or it's not something you should address, because you should. When people say certain words, those are triggers to you to go, okay, come on, let's go get some help.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I mean, we're looking at this whole prevention thing, this threat assessment thing is
Yep.
basically it's people who are in crisis for the most part that need help. And if you ignore that, the crisis doesn't go away. And so just as you mentioned, if you see somebody in crisis, don't just say something, do something, right? And if you can't do it, please get someone else who has that skill set to do, because they're just looking for help. And the problem is that this is a unique type of problem. These people, when they become offenders, they become very violent and very targeted, and that's why we call it targeted violence. So even more important to deal with these type of people who are in crisis, because if the crisis isn't solved and they don't have someone they can talk to, that they can eliminate that grievance, then violence will happen at some point along that path, once they're crossing on the different steps of that pathway to violence. And so
And
you
it's
got
inter- it's
very
inter- it, it's interesting, Doc, because targeted violence can be to yourself, right?
sure.
I mean, I
Sure.
mean, don't ever, don't ever let somebody be alone when they're in that place. Don't ever give them the opportunity not to be around somebody that can help them. This stuff scares me to death. I just remember I was trying another airman that was being let go out of the military because he had gotten in trouble too many times. And I hadn't seen him for like 30 minutes or 45 minutes. He's supposed to be in my office. I'm like, where is he? I went over to his house, and he was sitting in his house drinking himself to death. Um, so, we got him help. I had his mom come pick him up. A 22-year-old young man had his mom come pick him up and fly him home to make sure he was safe, because I was so worried he was going to hurt himself.
Yeah, that's a really really good point, Dave. Targeted violence can, we think about it in terms of being the expression being outward towards another person as the grievance. But when someone's in crisis and it's directed toward themselves, they go through the exact same steps. They'll write notes. They'll prepare for how they're going to kill themselves, or they'll research it. They'll plan it. They go through the exact same thing. The only difference is the crisis is more geared, inward than outward against someone else. But the very same things that we do in threat assessment for your typical targeted violence person who's in crisis, right? You do for suicidal people. And the thing is with suicidal people is once they make up their mind, and they've got the means and the
Yeah.
opportunity, there's nothing you can do about it. But that pathway for a suicidal person gives us that opportunity or window to help them, just like you expressed on going to that airman's house.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy, and we want a solution. Well, like, folks, I'm going to tell you this: the solution's on the left side of all this. The solution is in being a human being and taking care of your team and your teammates. The solution is looking out for people who are in a crisis period, and getting them the help and relieving that crisis before it happens. If you want to avoid school shootings, school targeted violence events, if you want to avoid innocent people getting hurt, then be a good neighbor. know what's going on in your community, look after people, ask them if they need help, get them help when they do. Don't just sit back and go, well, this isn't my problem, because it is.
Absolutely. Well said.
All right, Doc, we got anything else today?
No, that's it. I'm ready to start the weekend.
All right. Well, I said criminal intent, but I meant criminal minds. I realized I had a faux pas on my show. So
Well, the answer to that is still a resounding no.
Well, I appreciate your expertise. Thank you for all you do for SafeDefend. Thank you for all you do for our schools across America. We're looking forward to bringing SafeDefend into schools in Oklahoma as soon as we can. Oklahoma needs it. It's a great state to get kicked off in, because we're in so many others. With that, folks, I'm Dave Evans with Doc Becky. We are out of here.
Have a great weekend.